Hi everyone. First of all, I'd like to say a huge thank you to those who watched my last video. Why did the WCW versus WWF invasion suck? If you've not had a chance to watch it, then I'll leave a link in the description. In that video, I went into depth as a WCW fan about what I felt was wrong with the invasion storyline, doing my absolute best to use some examples other YouTubers hadn't. I also touched upon what I thought Vince McMahon should have done differently with WCW once he purchased it, but I didn't diverge into storylines as that would have made the video far too long. Anyway, enough of you requested that I made such a video, so here it is, how I would book the invasion storyline myself. First of all, I'll say how awesome would it be if they just made a game about it, where they can now take as much time as they like coming up with the best storylines without worrying about injuries or budgets or deaths or contracts or resentment between Vince McMahon and some WCW wrestlers. If they bought this game out, I'd let them max out my credit card, but that's a video topic for another day. So as awesome as it would have been having Eric Bischoff coming out on Raw during the live telecast, introducing himself as the new owner of WCW, and having Goldberg appear behind Vince McMahon before spearing him, especially considering that even the WWF fans were chanting Goldberg's name that evening. It just wasn't practical for a number of reasons. So I'm going to be fair to Vince McMahon and work under the same limitations he had after buying the company. This means I'm going to be reasonable with the budget, and apart from one exception, I'm not going to have any eye-watering buyout clauses for wrestlers who are still under contract with AOL. However, that doesn't stop me simply delaying the start of this angle and waiting for most of the AOL contracts to run out, which is something Vince had the freedom to do all along. To save money, I'm simply going to release or premeditate the releases of a lot of the WWF mid-carders once WCW was bought. Test and Perry Saturn especially got a lot of TV time and decent pushes during this angle, only for nothing to really be done with them once it was over. Most of the others' contracts ran out during the invasion angle anyway, so although I like them, we just won't need them. There's 20 talents I want to sign, which I won't reveal yet just so I don't ruin any surprises. To put it into context, there were 21 televised talents who were signed for the actual invasion we got, so it's one wrestler less. While it's true that the talents I want will have higher salaries, not signing most of these wrestlers and waiting for the WWF contracts to run out for the mid-carders I mentioned will go towards affording the stars I want to bring in. The vast majority of them would go on to sign for the WWF anyway. This angle is going to make a lot of money too. The Bad Invasion pay-per-view we got is still one of the highest grossing events the WWE has ever put on. Doing a decent storyline should also keep these types of buy rates up. Some of the talents I'm signing will also only have a 1-year deal, which is a short-term expense to ideally put over some of the younger WWF talent. Rule number 2, I can't bring in a wrestler who very publicly at the time said they had no interest in working for the WWF. Huge shame we can't use Bret Hart even as an on-screen character. Put it in the game. Speaking of the game, I'm also going to be consistent with injuries, so I can't use a wrestler in a time frame when they were out injured. This means I can't just use Triple H and Chris Benoit in the timeline while they were out of action. However, as I'm acting as owner of the company, I can bring in a wrestler who I think would have been willing to work for the WWF, even if Vince McMahon himself didn't personally like them. Before I start, we need to acknowledge that there is hindsight here. Many fans, for example, felt that Hulk Hogan and Ric Flair were way past their sell-by dates before the WWF revived their careers. So I think we need to have that self-awareness before you automatically write off any other talent who I might decide to include in this angle. I don't think it's a coincidence, for example, that by far the most popular How I Would Have Booked This Angle YouTube video only ever features former WCW wrestlers who just so happen to have had a career in the WWF. We can't underestimate how the WWF might have influenced our perception. I've also recycled some storyline elements that actually happened before and after the invasion angle, because some of them were good ideas, but I think were just implemented poorly. But if you disagree, that's fine. Let me know in the comments what you would have done differently. I thought the final show of Nitro with the joint telecast with Raw was really great, so considering the limitations at the time, I would have kept this the way it was. 2 months after the purchase of WCW, the invasion officially started on May the 28th, 2001, with Lance Storm doing a super kick to Perry Saturn. In between WCW being purchased and Lance Storm's debut, Shane was the owner of WCW in storyline, but it was generally business as usual. For the sake of doing this angle properly, I'm simply going to delay the start of the invasion to less than 4 months later at the Unforgiven pay-per-view, which was the 23rd of September 2001. Some things I'd change prior to Unforgiven though is reinstating Mick Foley as the WWF's commissioner instead of William Regal. I also wouldn't have retired the women's title like it was at the time, and I would have Lita as the women's champion. The Rock also returned during this timeline, and he's feuding with a still heel Stone Cold Steve Austin after what happened at WrestleMania 17. The reason I'm delaying this storyline by 4 months is that it will allow a lot of wrestlers' contracts to expire, so we're basically setting this angle up to succeed. Right, so it's the September 17th episode of Raw, and it's been 6 months since Shane bought WCW. Vince McMahon comes out to the ring and says, "You know, Shane, I've gone easy on you because you apparently own an entire wrestling company. But where are they, Shane? Where are these WCW wrestlers? Where is your WCW champion? I realise no one's turned up because they're too scared, or they simply refuse to work for someone like you. So I propose that at Unforgiven it's going to be you versus the Big Show, one-on-one in a last man standing match." So the match is booked between the Big Show and Shane McMahon at Unforgiven. In the match, despite Shane's best efforts using the candlestick and everything else, the Big Show is just too much for him when suddenly Booker T arrives and hits the Big Show with the big WCW belt before Shane's incredible elbow drop, with Booker T holding Shane up for the 10 count, which declares him the winner. So this is basically a replica of the brilliant match we got between the two at Backlash 2001, but we're simply delaying it, and instead of Test assisting Shane McMahon, is going to be a WCW wrestler, which makes a lot more sense. Booker T carries Shane to the WCW marked car, and it gets driven away. The rest of the pay-per-view is business as usual, with the main event looking like this. The next night on Raw, Vince McMahon is constantly looking over his shoulder and jumps up with fright every time someone approaches him. He eventually comes to the ring and tries to reassure himself that he's not frightened, that someone else from WCW might turn up, and says, "Okay, Shane, so you've only managed to bring one WCW wrestler here, and I propose that our WWF champion Stone Cold Steve Austin faces your WCW champion Booker T in the main event at No Mercy. If Stone Cold wins, you, Booker T, and anyone else from WCW has to stay away for good." Shane's music hits and he says, "Vince, you've only had a small taste of what's to come. I have plenty more surprises up my sleeve." He then does a diamond shape with his hand, and DDP runs out from the crowd and delivers a diamond cutter before running back. And over the coming weeks, this leads to Vince being emotionally unstable, recounting how WCW almost put him out of business. The next pay-per-view is No Mercy, and in that pay-per-view, the main event looks like this. WCW champion Booker T defeats WWF champion Stone Cold Steve Austin. In this match, Kurt Angle interferes when the referee's unconscious to help Stone Cold, but the lights go out, come back on, and Sting is in the ring, who uses his bat to hit Kurt Angle before he does his Scorpion Death Drop on Stone Cold, which allows Booker T to cover him 1, 2, 3. Now, Sting, as we know, didn't sign for the WWF because he was worried about how he'd be booked. But since WCW was purchased 6 months prior, this gives us time to persuade him that he would be booked in good faith, and we're going to respect his legacy. After the No Mercy pay-per-view in the upcoming weeks on Raw and SmackDown, you're getting more interference from WCW wrestlers, with Kidman interfering in a match against X-Pac, Rey Mysterio interfering against Jeff Hardy, Mike Awesome and Lance Storm beating up the APA backstage, DDP confronting The Rock and telling him he's the real people's champion before they're brawling, Medusa hitting Lita with the women's title, Lex Luger assaulting Edge backstage, which puts him out of action, and the Brothers of Destruction losing the tag team titles to the Dudley Boys because of interference from the Steiner brothers. Now, to me, Medusa, who is known as Alundra Blaze in the WWF, is a no-brainer in this fantasy booking angle, as she was the one competent female wrestler that WCW had, who was there until the very end, and she also had a lot of history as a former WWF Women's Champion. The Steiner brothers and Lex Luger were also in WCW until the very end, and their contracts were up soon at this point, with all of them featuring for New Japan or the WWA during or shortly after this period, so I'm confident that we could have persuaded them to come. So after these attacks from WCW on the WWF wrestlers, Vince McMahon calls a meeting with his WWF roster, and he's essentially trying to rally his troops. He tells them that they've beaten WCW before, and they're going to do it again at Invasion, which has replaced Survivor Series. Vince does tell them not to take them lightly though, as WCW has been on top before, and under Shane McMahon are a serious threat once again. Vince proposes a 5 vs 5 match in the main event of Invasion, and his team is The Rock, Stone Cold Steve Austin, The Undertaker, Kane, and Kurt Angle, with Team WCW consisting of Booker T, DDP, Sting, and the Steiner brothers. The Rock and Austin are still at loggerheads, and The Undertaker and Kane have never liked Kurt Angle, so their team feels a bit less united. Chris Jericho is understandably upset about not being selected, and he does a promo about how awful his time in WCW was, and how he feels he's currently being held down like he was in that company. Shane McMahon walks out and says, "You know, Chris, if I was in charge of WCW while you were there, there's no way I would have ever let you go. Why don't you come back under my leadership and you'll be challenging at the very top once again?" Chris refuses this offer, and Shane responds by saying, "In that case, you want an opponent at Invasion? You've got it." Bang! It's Jeff Jarrett. Now, I know what some of you are thinking. He would never have worked for Vince McMahon because he eventually helped set up TNA, but I actually don't think that's true. He was out of a job and wrestling for small promotions like the WWA before TNA was finally formed, so I think a job offer at the last big wrestling company left in America would have been too good for him to refuse. The research I've done points more to the birth of TNA as a response to him and some of his friends not having a job. He was also out of contract during this period, and while I certainly wouldn't have put him in the main event like he was in WCW or TNA, he was a competent mid-carder in the WWF, and I think would have been very useful in putting over some of the younger stars there, but more on that later. Lex Luger and Rick Steiner were also with WCW until the very end, and in the short term I feel still had a lot to offer as wrestling veterans. Again, just my personal opinion, don't believe absolutely everything the WWF tells you. So after hitting Chris Jericho over the head, Jeff Jarrett grabs the microphone and says, "You can't fire me, Vince. I am capital H-E-R-E here, and I'm here to challenge you, Chris, at Invasion to help WCW kick your..." And all this sets up Invasion as being a genuine WCW versus WWF event, with all 9 matches featuring invading WCW talent, as opposed to the actual Invasion we got, which were mainly just WWF wrestlers. Some of you might point out that there's some stars missing here, but we need to remember that this angle isn't a sprint, it's a marathon. But anyway, the Invasion match card looks like this. Kidman defeats X-Pac, the Dudley Boys defeat Chavo Guerrero and Shane Shane Helms. El Hebner defeats Nick Patrick. Rey Mysterio defeats Jeff Hardy in a hardcore ladder match. Lex Luger defeats Christian. Medusa defeats Lita to become the WWF Women's Champion. The APA defeat Mike Awesome and Lance Storm. Chris Jericho defeats Jeff Jarrett. So going into the main event, Team WCW and Team WWF have 4 victories each. Team WCW win the final match when the dirtiest player in the game, Ric Flair, who at this point had signed with the WWF, interferes. While there's a brawl on the outside with the other wrestlers, he comes into the ring, hits Stone Cold with the WCW belt from behind and throws the belt to The Rock, which causes Stone Cold to look up and think it was him. In retaliation, he delivers a stunner to The Rock before the Steiners pull Stone Cold out the ring, which allows Booker T to get the pinfall. 1, 2, 3. In the match between Lex Luger and Christian, Lex Luger won, but we're going to make Christian look like a hero here, despite being presented as the underdog. Luger after the match puts a chair in between Christian's leg with the intention to break it, but Shane McMahon comes out and stops him from doing so, which causes Luger to break Shane's leg instead, and Booker T comes out and pushes Luger, who walks away from the ring laughing, with Linda and Stephanie also coming out to comfort Shane. What we're doing here is trying to present Shane, and at least some of the WCW wrestlers, as faces. The aftermath of Shane's injury the next night on Raw leads Stephanie and Linda McMahon finding themselves stuck in the middle of the feud between Vince and Shane, and they express their worry about Shane's injury to Vince, who ultimately says that he brought this on himself. Vince McMahon then comes out to the ring and says Lex Luger can't be trusted by anyone, making reference to the fact that he joined WCW behind his back to be on the very first episode of Nitro when he was booked to be on Monday Night Raw that evening. He says that Jeff Jarrett was cut from the same mould by threatening to no-show a pay-per-view if he wasn't paid triple, and also shows clips of Medusa's disrespect of going to WCW in 1995 with the WWF Women's title and throwing it in the trash. So we're giving examples of some of the real-life history and tension between both companies, which was shockingly missed in the actual Invasion storyline we got. Vince then goes on to say that as the owner of WCW is now out of action, it means that the company can't function, so he declares the WWF as the winner of the war. He goes on to say, "So to all you WCW wrestlers, get the hell out of my building." Just then, Commissioner Mick Foley's music hits, and he says that Shane's contacted him from the hospital to say that he's appointed a general manager to run WCW while he's away, who'll be making their appearance later that evening. Vince challenges the general manager in the main event that night, fully expecting it to be Mr. WCW Ric Flair, who had made his debut the night before at Invasion. Vince finally makes his appearance for the last match on Raw, and after a short pause, Eric Bischoff's music hits. Vince McMahon is standing in the ring looking absolutely stunned, while Eric, who's on the entrance ramp, says, "Hey Vince, did you miss me? When your son was going to hire a general manager to run WCW, just who the hell did you think he was talking about? You know, earlier tonight you talked about all the bad things WCW did, but it's really just jealousy about the fact that I'm the only person who was able to beat your 83 weeks in a row. You thought last night's Invasion was bad? You ain't seen nothing yet. In fact, your top stars haven't even faced our A-team." Vince stands there stunned and confused, and Eric's just standing there smiling before you hear the music of the NWO. Hall and Nash come to the ring through the crowd and stand either side of Vince. They point to the entrance and out comes Hollywood Hulk Hogan. When Hogan comes to the ring, they beat Vince up and spray NWO on his back, with Eric walking into the ring, sarcastically putting his foot on Vince, with Nash counting the pinfall 1, 2, 3, and that's the end of Raw. Now, the date of this Raw is November the 19th, 2001, and in real life the NWO was signed just 2 months later, so I'm certain a deal could have been done which wouldn't have broke the bank. Anyway, that's the end of part 1. Let me know what you think in the comments, and if there's interest I'll bring out part 2.